Hey guys, tonight we begin with a tale of velvet tables, whispered bets, and a king who could never resist the lure of a game. This is the story of Charles II, the man they called the Merry Monarch, a ruler remembered for his charm, wit, and theatrical flair, but also for scandal, corruption, and a weakness that would forever stain his reign: his insatiable hunger for gambling. His story is one of kingdoms nearly lost at the turn of a card, mistresses showered with jewels that weren't truly his to give, and debts that followed him like a phantom across the marble halls of Whitehall. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, settle in. Close your eyes if you wish, and picture the glow of 1,000 candles flickering against the green felt of a gambling table. Cards slip between fingers like restless birds. Dice clatter across polished wood with the echo of fate. And golden coins, heavy, gleaming, and cursed, glitter like stars fallen from heaven, as the air is thick with smoke, wine, and the perfume of women whose laughter hides dangerous secrets. Outside, the city of London sleeps under the pale moon, but within the royal chambers, the game never ends. Charles II was no ordinary king. He came to power in 1660 after years of chaos: the English Civil War, the beheading of his father, King Charles I, and the rule of Oliver Cromwell's grim Puritan regime. For nearly 2 decades, Charles lived in exile, wandering across Europe, penniless, dependent on the charity of foreign courts. Imagine him then, a young prince, watching other kings gamble at courts in France and Holland, tasting both pleasure and humiliation. Dreaming of the throne that was once his father's, he learned quickly that fortune could change with a roll of dice or the turn of a card. He learned to smile even in ruin, to bluff when his purse was empty, to charm when his power was gone. Gambling was not merely a vice. It became his survival. When Cromwell's republic collapsed and the monarchy was restored, Charles returned to England in triumph. Crowds lined the streets, bells rang, bonfires lit the skies. The people rejoiced at the return of their king. They longed for merriment after years of strict Puritan austerity, when even theater and music had been banned. And Charles gave it to them. He filled his court with laughter, art, music, feasts, mistresses, and above all, games of chance. The court of Charles II was unlike any before it. Whitehall Palace became less a seat of solemn governance and more a theater of pleasure. Gambling tables stood beside thrones. Velvet-draped chambers echoed not just with debates of state, but with the shuffle of cards and the clink of dice. Diplomats, courtiers, mistresses, and foreign envoys all joined the games. It was said that anyone could win a king's favor over a hand of cards, or lose it just as quickly. For Charles, gambling was not a pastime. It was an addiction, a ritual, a seduction of fate. Imagine it now, the hush of a midnight court. The king leans forward, his long dark hair falling around his face, eyes glittering with the intoxication of chance. His hand hovers over cards as courtiers watch with bated breath. Mistresses lounge on embroidered cushions, their jewels catching the candlelight, their laughter mingling with the scent of wine. Servants stand silently by, trained to ignore the curses and cries of men losing fortunes. The air is thick with tension, as if every roll of dice carried not only gold, but destiny itself. Among his companions at these tables were some of the most notorious women of the age. Barbara Villiers, the raven-haired mistress whose temper was as fiery as her beauty, often goaded the king into reckless wagers. Nell Gwynn, the witty orange seller turned actress, cheered and teased him as he staked sums that could have fed entire villages. Louise Day, the French mistress rumored to be a spy, whispered sweet encouragements in her soft accent as Charles chased losses with more and more coin. These women were more than companions. They were symbols of his recklessness. The jewels they wore were often won at the tables or bought on credit the crown could not afford. But Charles was never satisfied. "I'll mutter." How much he won, the thrill faded too quickly. No matter how much he lost, he believed fortune would turn in his favor with the next hand. And always the stakes grew higher. Whispers spread across London that the king wagered not only money, but land, privileges, even political favors. Some claimed he once risked entire appointments in government on a game. Others swore he bet jewels that had belonged to his grandmother, Queen Anne of Denmark. Truth or rumor in his court, scandal and fact blurred until they were indistinguishable. This was the paradox of Charles II. Outwardly, he was charming, witty, generous. His court glittered with splendor. Beneath it lay rot. Debts so vast they haunted the treasury. Political decisions influenced not by reason but by wagers. Mistresses and courtiers enriched while the common people bore the weight of taxation. Even foreign powers learned of his weakness. Ambassadors from France and Spain, desperate to sway English policy, sometimes joined him at the tables. A well-played hand, it was whispered, could win more than gold. It could win treaties. And yet Charles could not stop. Picture again the stillness of a royal chamber long after midnight. The fire has burned low. Shadows stretch across marble floors, and yet the king is still at the table. His fingers drum impatiently as another hand is dealt. His smile is sly, his eyes tired but restless. Around him, the courtiers are slumped with exhaustion, but none dare leave before the king. Servants refill goblets of wine, mistresses curl in silks, and still the king plays. The game is everything. What kind of ruler was this? A king who once wandered Europe in poverty, now gambling away the riches of his restored crown. A monarch who gave his people laughter, theater, and music, but who in private risked their future on cards and dice. A man who could charm any woman, sway any crowd, and yet could not conquer his own hunger for chance. This is the story we begin tonight, the life of Charles II, the king who could not stop gambling. His rise from exile, his glittering restoration court, his mistresses who shaped scandal as much as history, and the debts and betrayals that shadowed his reign. In the end, his legacy would be remembered not only for his wit and his laughter, but for the ruinous appetite that consumed him. And remember, this is only the beginning. The sound of dice rattling across wooden boards. The hushed tension of men leaning forward, eyes fixed on ivory cubes as though they carried the weight of prophecy. The soft slide of cards over felt. For Charles, gambling was not born in the glitter of Whitehall, but in the shadows of exile. Imagine him young and restless, cast adrift after his father's execution in 1649. He was only 19 when the axe fell on King Charles I, a prince without a throne, without coin, without certainty. The shock of that moment carved itself deep into his soul. Where once he had been heir to England, Scotland, and Ireland, now he was a fugitive. A hunted man moving from one foreign court to another, begging favors from monarchs who offered him shelter, not out of loyalty, but calculation. In France, the exiled prince wandered halls that shimmered with decadence. Versailles was a hive of games, flirtations, and political whispers disguised as entertainments. Here, gambling was not merely tolerated, it was ritualized, woven into the very structure of aristocratic life. Princes and dukes wagered fortunes under the gaze of chandeliers. Courtiers staked their honor on a roll of dice, and even queens leaned across tables, eyes glittering with hunger for chance. For Charles, it was intoxicating. He watched, he learned, he played. At first, it was small. He had little to risk beyond the few coins granted him by allies. But soon, necessity taught him the art of survival. A game, I meant food, lodging, perhaps even a horse to carry him onward. A game lost left him desperate, forced to charm or flatter his way into another borrowed purse. He became a master of bluff, not only at the tables, but in life. A smile here, a promise there, a laugh that disarmed suspicion. He learned to lose gracefully, to win charmingly, and to mask his fear beneath wit. These years hardened him. To gamble when you are rich is indulgence. To gamble when you are poor is desperation. For Charles, it was both. The tables of Europe became his training ground, and with every shuffled deck, his fascination grew. The thrill of risk seeped into his veins. Losses could be explained away. Fortune was fickle, after all. Wins tasted like destiny. And soon, he came to believe that his life itself was one long wager. Against Cromwell, against exile, against fate. But exile was not only games and glamour, it was humiliation. Charles, once prince of a mighty kingdom, found himself treated as a pawn. He depended on the grudging hospitality of foreign rulers who calculated his worth in the chessboard of European politics. He accepted French generosity, but it came with strings. Whispers that he might, one day, be France's puppet if restored. In Spain, he felt suspicion. In Holland, he felt both admiration and distance. Everywhere, he was the king without a throne. These courts fed his taste for risk. They also fed his weakness. In France especially, gambling was inseparable from seduction. Women drifted through the salons, perfumed and painted, their laughter as dangerous as the stakes on the tables. Charles, tall, dark, with an easy wit, became a favorite. They liked him, and he liked them more. Mistresses eased his loneliness. Some gave him coin, others gave him comfort, all gave him distraction. Gambling and women twined together in his mind, inseparable. To play was to win fortune, to charm was to win desire. One hand of cards might bring him both, and yet, even in exile, ruin followed. He borrowed constantly. He owed debts he could not pay. Promises were scrawled across parchment. Future rewards, titles, lands, once he was restored to his throne. Debts became chains, binding him even as he laughed across gaming tables. He was already mortgaging the future of his kingship before he ever wore the crown. The English Civil War had left scars deeper than money. His father's blood haunted him. He knew he must reclaim his throne, but he also knew the odds. Each alliance was a wager. Each whispered promise from foreign rulers was another bet placed on the great table of Europe. Would England welcome him back? Would Scotland rally? Would the people forgive the sins of monarchy after Cromwell's republic? To gamble at cards was to distract himself from gambling with destiny. And then, in 1660, fate finally turned. The Protectorate crumbled after Cromwell's death. Parliament, weary of disorder, invited Charles back. The long exile ended in a sudden cascade of fortune. He rode into London not as a desperate wanderer, but as a king reborn. Crowds cheered, bells rang, and flowers rained down upon him. He was restored gloriously, triumphantly, almost miraculously. For Charles, it felt like the ultimate gamble won. Against impossible odds, he had survived, waited, and triumphed. And this victory only deepened his addiction. If his life itself could be redeemed by fortune, then why not every wager? If kingdoms could be restored by chance, then surely luck was on his side always. His reign would prove him wrong, but in that moment he believed he could never lose again. As king, he filled his palace with the pleasures he had missed. Theaters reopened, music soared, laughter echoed through London. Whitehall became a carnival of entertainment. But at the heart of it all, at the very center of his joy, were the tables, cards, dice, gold, and the intoxicating sense that luck was a lover who would never abandon him. Now, picture him again, not in exile, but in triumph. A king seated at a velvet-draped table, mistresses leaning close, courtiers whispering, servants silent. The candles flare, dice roll, cards slide. Round him, power hums like a current. He is no longer the desperate prince begging favors in foreign courts. He is master of England, yet the lessons of exile cling to him still. The belief that chance rules all, that fortune favors the daring, that a man who risks everything may win everything. But as with all gamblers, the wheel would turn. And soon, Charles would discover that a king's losses are never his alone. The Restoration had come with fireworks, bells, and a river of wine spilling through London's streets. The air itself seemed to hum with relief. After years of Puritan austerity under Cromwell, the people wanted color, laughter, music, and their king gave it to them in abundance. Charles II was not only restored, he was celebrated as a kind of savior of joy. Theaters reopened. Women, for the first time in English history, were allowed to act on stage. Streets filled with bawdy songs. Fashion bloomed in silks and ribbons. Pleasure returned like a tide that had been dammed for too long. And Charles, standing at the heart of it all, was its conductor. But beneath the gaiety, something more subtle stirred. For Charles, the Restoration was not just the return of monarchy. It was a personal vindication, proof that fortune had smiled on him after years of despair. He believed he was chosen by luck itself. And what does a gambler do when he feels favored by chance? He gambles more. Whitehall Palace, his seat of power, transformed into a labyrinth of entertainments. Yes, there were solemn councils and affairs of state, but behind gilded doors, there were also endless feasts, late-night masks, dances, and always the gaming tables. The palace glittered with candlelight. Courtiers leaned over cards, their jewels flashing as coins changed hands. Gold, promises, even titles were wagered in the heat of play. Charles was not content to merely watch. He played. Endlessly, recklessly, joyously. He staked not only his coin, but his authority. His mistresses sat beside him, laughing at his jokes, teasing him when he lost, whispering encouragement when the dice seemed cruel. Courtiers desperate to please let him win at times. But he knew, and he did not care. The point was not the money, not even the victory. The point was the thrill. The Restoration Court became famous for its success. Diplomats from abroad reported home with astonishment. Here was a king who spent more nights at the card tables than at council. Here was a ruler who laughed with actresses, feasted with poets, and gambled with dukes as though kingdoms were toys. But there was danger in this spectacle. Every coin he lost was the people's coin. Every debt he racked up was the kingdom's burden, and Charles's debts were monstrous. He lost thousands of pounds in a single evening. Sometimes entire estates passed across tables, ruined families paying the price of his pleasure. He borrowed endlessly from wealthy courtiers and foreign allies. The French king Louis XIV, sly and calculating, learned quickly that Charles's weakness could be bought. Gold flowed from Versailles to Whitehall, not as gifts but as investments. In exchange for subsidies, Charles promised favors, policies, whispers of loyalty. Gambling had moved beyond dice and cards. Now it was diplomacy itself. And still he laughed. Still he played. His mistresses were part of the spectacle. Barbara Palmer, bold and brazen, was often at his side, her sharp tongue mocking him when he lost. Nell Gwynn, the actress who had risen from orange seller to royal favorite, made a performance of teasing him, making even his losses into entertainment. Others came and went, each adding their charm to the king's theater of chance. For Charles, gambling and seduction were inseparable. Cards were foreplay, dice were intimacy, victory was climax. The women were as much a part of the game as the gold. But every gambler knows, fortune turns. Charles's losses mounted. To pay them, he borrowed more, promised more, compromised more. Taxes rose, creditors pressed, Parliament grumbled. Ministers tried to restrain him, but Charles was slippery, evasive. He joked away their concerns, deflected with charm, or simply ignored them. He believed always that luck would swing back in his favor, and sometimes it did. He won grandly on occasion, enough to convince himself that fortune still loved him. When dice fell kindly, or cards turned in his favor, he laughed until the palace walls rang. Ow! But the truth was crueler. His losses always outweighed his wins. The debts grew, the kingdom groaned, and yet the king played on. What made it worse and more fascinating was the way gambling became woven into his politics. Ambassadors discovered that the gaming tables were where influence could be bought. A clever man might lose deliberately to the king, currying favor with every coin surrendered. A mistress might distract him at the right moment, tipping the balance of his decisions. Policies were whispered between throws of dice. Treaties were sealed with wagers. England's future was staked on games of chance, played under candlelight with laughter masking the stakes. The people, too, began to murmur. Pamphlets circulated mocking their king's obsession. Satirists painted him as a man ruled by dice rather than duty. Yet Charles remained popular in a strange way. His charm was disarming. He laughed at the jokes about himself. He admitted his vices openly. "I am not a good man," he once said, "but I am a merry one." And perhaps, after years of Puritan rule, the people preferred a merry sinner to a joyless saint. Still, the kingdom paid the price. Wars drained the treasury. Fires ravaged London. Plague swept through the city, and yet at Whitehall the tables clattered on. For Charles, gambling was not merely indulgence. It was escape. The weight of a kingdom, the memory of exile, the shadow of his father's execution, all vanished when the dice rolled. For a moment, he was not a king haunted by history. He was only a man, waiting for fortune to smile. But fortune, as gamblers learn, is crueler than any enemy. The debts tightened around him like chains. Ministers begged him to stop. Parliament resisted his demands for more money. Foreign powers mocked him even as they bribed him. And all the while, Charles smiled, joked, and shuffled the cards again. To his lovers, to his friends, to his courtiers, he seemed endlessly careless.
Oh.
But in private, did he ever feel the weight? Did he ever wonder whether fortune had abandoned him at last? Perhaps. For in his later years, the laughter grew quieter, the winds rarer, the debts heavier. The king, who had once believed himself chosen by luck, began to look over his shoulder, as though fearing the tables had turned forever. And yet he never stopped playing. Not until the end. The gaming tables of Whitehall were more than diversions. They became a theater of power, where alliances were formed, loyalties tested, and fortunes destroyed. Courtiers would cluster in the candlelit halls, the air thick with tobacco smoke and perfume, their ears tuned to the clatter of dice and the shuffle of cards. It was here, amid the velvet drapes and flickering chandeliers, that England's king revealed his truest self. Charles, too, was magnetic. He had the gift of making even his enemies laugh, of turning insults into jokes, making everyone believe, for a moment, that fortune favored him. When he leaned over the table, cards in hand, even the most hardened of courtiers felt drawn into his orbit. He teased, he cajoled, he mocked, and all the while gold coins piled and vanished. But as the years pressed on, the losses grew undeniable. Charles's gambling debts were not just numbers on parchment. They were ships left unfunded, soldiers left unpaid, roads left unrepaired. England's coffers bled, and still the king wagered. Parliament grew restless. Members rose to complain of the king's extravagance, of his constant borrowing. They demanded accountability, but Charles, ever the gambler, slipped from their grasp. He laughed off their accusations, shifted blame, and promised reform. Yet as soon as the council chambers emptied, he returned to his cards, and then came the French money. Louis XIV, the Sun King, was everything Charles was not: disciplined, calculating, determined to control not just his court, but the destiny of Europe. Louis saw Charles's weakness clearly. Here was a monarch ruled not by policy, but by pleasure. And so, through secret subsidies, he fed the addiction. French gold arrived quietly in Whitehall, disguised as support for Charles's wars. But in truth, much of it vanished across the gaming tables. Charles was no fool. He knew what Louis was doing, but he accepted the money anyway, convincing himself it was strategy. England's interests, he claimed, were served by French alliance. Yet in truth, it was his own debts that were being paid, his own wagers that were being covered. England's sovereignty became entangled with the king's vice. The irony was sharp. Charles, who had fought so hard to regain his throne, now gambled away its independence for coin. And still he smiled. Still he played. His mistresses, too, were drawn into this spiral. Barbara Palmer, Countess of Castlemaine, was notorious for her influence over the king's purse. She encouraged his gambling, sometimes joining him at the tables, her laughter ringing over the clink of coins. When Charles lost, she was there to soothe him or to remind him of who might lend him money next. Others, like Louise D., the French-born mistress, served as subtle agents of Louis XIV, guiding the king's choices with a lover's whisper. It was seduction layered upon seduction. Women, gold, and cards. Each fed the other, each tangled Charles deeper in webs of dependence. But even kings cannot hide forever from consequences. By the 1670s, England was weary. Wars with the Dutch strained the treasury. The Great Fire of London had reduced the city to ashes. The plague had left thousands dead. And yet the king's gambling continued, as if untouched by the world's suffering. Pamphleteers mocked him openly now. Caricatures depicted him tossing dice while the nation starved. Sermons thundered against the sin of gaming, pointing to the king as its worst example. Charles, as always, brushed it off. He joked that he was a martyr to cards. He declared that England needed merriment, that joy was as essential as bread. Many people, weary of Puritan severity still lingering from Cromwell's rule, agreed. But beneath the laughter, resentment grew, and then there were the scandals. One story tells of a night when Charles lost not only gold but a royal jewel, a piece meant to symbolize the crown itself. It passed across the table into the hands of a grinning courtier, who wore it openly the next day. The symbolism was too sharp to miss. England's king had gambled away his crown, if only in miniature. Another tale whispers of estates lost, lands promised to nobles in exchange for debts covered. Some courtiers grew rich from these transfers, others ruined. Families rose and fell, not through battle or inheritance, but through the luck of cards played at midnight while the king laughed. The stakes only grew higher. Gambling was no longer just a pastime. It was a disease infecting the machinery of state. Foreign ambassadors reported that policies could be bought for the price of a wager. A shrewd player might lose a hand deliberately, winning not money but influence. Thus the king's vice became the court's currency, a corrupt economy where luck dictated loyalty. And yet, in Charles's eyes, it was all theater. He loved the spectacle, the drama of a close game, the roar of laughter when fortune turned. He thrived on the suspense, the way courtiers leaned in, breathless, as dice rolled across the table. For a man who had lived through exile, through defeat, through the execution of his father, perhaps the gaming table was a way to wrest control from fate. Here, at least, fortune was visible, tangible, immediate. He could touch it, test it, defy it. But fortune, as history shows, cannot be controlled. As the debts deepened, Charles was forced into more dangerous bargains. He dissolved Parliament when it pressed him too hard, only to recall it when money grew scarce. He promised reforms, promised loyalty to Protestantism, even as he quietly accepted Catholic French gold. Every decision was another wager, every alliance another gamble. The people grew anxious. Rumors spread that the king was selling England to France, that he cared more for dice than for duty. In taverns and coffee houses, men muttered that a gambler's hand could not guide a kingdom. The Restoration once celebrated now seemed a burden, and yet Charles endured. He had a genius for survival. Where other monarchs fell to assassins, rebellions, or revolutions, Charles slipped past danger with charm. He laughed at his critics, turned enemies into drinking companions, seduced the wives of those who plotted against him. He had, even in his decline, the gambler's greatest gift, the ability to make others believe that the next throw of the dice would be the winning one. And so the games continued. Night after night, Whitehall pulsed with music, laughter, and the clatter of dice. Gold coins spilled like water, debts deepened like trenches, and the kingdom itself tilted on the edge of ruin. For Charles, it was all one endless game, a game he could never walk away from. As the years wore on, the laughter in Whitehall began to sound more hollow. The same jokes were told, The same dice clattered, the same courtiers bowed and scraped. Yet the weight of time pressed heavier on Charles II, and even he could not ignore the creeping shadow of decline. The 1680s opened with a kingdom restless and suspicious. England was tangled in religious strife, torn between Protestant fears and Catholic sympathies. Charles's brother, James, Duke of York, was openly Catholic, and whispers grew that the king himself leaned the same way. In the alehouses and marketplaces, tongues wagged that French gold was not just funding Charles's gambling, but steering England toward Rome. For the king, this was just another shuffle of the cards. Religion, politics, foreign diplomacy, they were all part of the game. He promised Parliament one thing, whispered another to his mistresses, and then gambled away the very funds he'd secured for national defense. His strategy, if it could be called that, was the same as at the table: bluff, charm, and hope that fortune turned in time. But fortune was becoming less forgiving. The royal coffers, already battered by wars and fire, were drained by debts so staggering that even his closest allies began to mutter. Estates were mortgaged, jewels pawned, and crown lands quietly sold off. Courtiers noticed that their winning streaks at the gaming tables were often rewarded with real lands or titles, a way for a net worth to settle accounts without coin. What had once been amusement was now cannibalizing the monarchy itself. The French subsidies continued, of course, but they came at a cost. Louis XIV was not a man to give without expecting returns. Charles was nudged into treaties and concessions that favored France, each agreement a reminder of debts owed not in gold, but in obedience. England's independence, its Protestant identity, its pride, all were tossed like chips into the pot of the king's addiction. And yet, through it all, Charles seemed untouchable. His charm had not abandoned him. He could still make enemies laugh, still make his mistresses swoon, still make his people cheer when he appeared in public. He understood spectacle better than anyone. He had seen what had happened to his father, who had marched to his death with dignity, but without popularity. Charles chose the opposite. He wrapped himself in entertainment, pleasure, and scandal, betting that joy was stronger than anger. For a time, it worked. London adored its merry monarch. Theaters thrived, music filled the streets, and festivals lit the nights. Common folk forgave his gambling, even his mistresses, because he seemed to embody freedom itself after the dark austerity of Cromwell's Puritan rule. Where Oliver Cromwell had banned dancing, Charles danced twice as hard. Where Cromwell had closed theaters, Charles built new stages. His very vices became virtues in the eyes of a people desperate for merriment. But beneath the merriment was rot. Foreign ambassadors reported that England was unstable, its king unreliable, its government compromised. Pamphlets mocked him as a jester rather than a monarch. Some depicted him as a dealer at a gaming table, shuffling not cards but laws, policies, and lives. Others drew him drowning in dice, his crown slipping beneath the waves. The public began to wonder, if the king gambled with his own fortune, what stopped him from gambling with theirs? Charles himself seemed unfazed. He had always lived with danger, always gambled with survival itself. From his days in exile, hiding from Cromwell's soldiers, to his triumphant return to London, luck had been his constant companion. Why should it abandon him now? He doubled down, confident that the next throw would save him. But time, unlike dice, cannot be rolled again. By 1685, Charles's health was failing. Years of indulgence, late nights, rich foods, endless drinking, and constant stress had taken their toll. He suffered from strokes, from fits of breathlessness, from sudden collapses that left courtiers whispering. Still, he refused to abandon his games. Even when weakened, he ordered the tables prepared, the cards shuffled, the gold brought out. The gaming rooms remained lit long into the night, as if their glow could ward off the darkness creeping ever closer. Mistresses attended him, still vying for influence. Barbara Palmer remained a tempestuous presence, while Louise de whispered French strategies in his ear. Nell Gwyn, the actress' stern mistress, beloved by the people, brought laughter to his bedside. Each of them had once shared in the thrill of his gambling nights, and now they shared in the sorrow of his decline. One story tells that on his final nights, when his body trembled with weakness, Charles still reached for cards. He held them loosely in his hand, a king stripped of power, but clinging to the only game he had ever truly mastered. The courtiers humored him, playing softly, letting him win. But he must have known the greatest gamble was already underway, and no charm, no bluff, no gold could tip its outcome. On February 6, 1685, Charles II breathed his last. He was 54 years old. The court fell silent. The merry monarch, who had once filled London with laughter, was gone. His brother James ascended the throne, and with him came a storm of conflict and division that Charles had, perhaps, always feared. In the days that followed, the people of England mourned. Despite his flaws, his gambling, his mistresses, his debts, they remembered him with affection. He had given them joy after years of repression. He had made them laugh when laughter seemed impossible. He had, in his way, gambled everything for merriment, and for a time he had won. But history's verdict was harsher. Scholars noted the squandered wealth, the compromised independence, the corruption of court and crown. They saw a man who could not master his own appetites, let alone a kingdom's destiny. They saw not just a king who loved games, but a king who treated monarchy itself as a game, and in doing so, left his successors to face the consequences. And yet, perhaps there was something tragically human in it all. Charles II, son of a king executed for solemnity and pride, chose levity instead. He gambled with his crown, his kingdom, and his soul, because he had lived too close to death not to crave the thrill of chance. In every shuffle of cards he saw the wheel of fortune itself, the eternal gamble of life and power. The dice have long since rolled, the cards long since turned. But the image endures, a king laughing in the candlelight as gold coins scatter across a table. A king who could not stop gambling, even as the world crumbled around him. When Charles II died in 1685, he left more than a crown to his brother James. He left a legacy of debts, scandals, and a court that had grown addicted to the same pleasures as its king. The palace walls still echoed with laughter. But beneath it all was a silence of unease. The uneasy quiet that follows a long night of reckless play. And the question lingered. What had Charles really gambled away? On the surface, he had lost money. Fortunes upon fortunes. Historians estimate that the sums he wagered across his lifetime amounted to millions in today's value. Palaces had been pawned, jewels sold, and crown lands auctioned just to keep pace with his endless appetite for risk. But the true stakes were not coins or gems. They were trust, stability, and sovereignty. Parliament had grown wary of him, not merely because he spent, but because he schemed. Time and again, Charles had treated governance like a gaming table, bluffing to Parliament while holding secret agreements with Louis XIV of France. He signed deals in candlelit chambers that undercut England's independence, securing French subsidies to cover his gambling debts, while promising loyalty to Catholic interests. Every time he shuffled cards in Whitehall, England's fate was shuffled with them. His people, though, remained forgiving. Common Londoners remembered him fondly, their old Rowley, a nickname born from his virility, comparing him to a stallion at stud. He had given them laughter after Cromwell's grey rule, and laughter was no small gift. In taverns, men repeated stories of his wit, his ability to deflate even the most pompous courtier with a single line. To them, his gambling was just another part of his roguish charm. But Europe saw things differently. To foreign courts, Charles was unreliable. A king who could be bought, a monarch who might abandon alliances on a whim if the pot at the table looked more promising elsewhere. Louis XIV, ever the Sun King, saw him as both an ally and a pawn, someone to be indulged and manipulated. Dutch leaders, burned by war with England, sneered at his frivolity. Even Spain, once his family's great rival, regarded him with disdain. And what of his mistresses? They, too, had been part of the gamble. Barbara Palmer, the tempestuous Countess of Castlemaine, had wielded immense influence during his early reign. Her whims shaped policy, her extravagance mirrored his. Louise Day, the French-born mistress, is less about passion than politics, serving as Louis XIV's unofficial agent in the king's bedchamber. Nell Gwyn, beloved by the people for her wit and earthiness, provided laughter where others offered intrigue. Each woman had played her hand at the table, and each had won something. Titles, wealth, recognition. But none had truly tamed the gambler at the center of it all. For Charles, women and wagers were cut from the same cloth. Both thrilled him, both tested his luck, both carried risk and reward. The difference was that mistresses could soothe his heart, while gambling devoured his kingdom. After his death, pamphleteers wasted no time in framing his life as cautionary tale. Some mocked him mercilessly, painting him as a jester in a crown, forever rolling dice while England sank. Others romanticized him, casting him as the tragic gambler king who had laughed too loudly, lived too brightly, and burned too fast. One popular ballad sang of him. He played 4 crowns, 4 kingdoms too, and lost them all ere night was through. But what had he truly lost? His brother James inherited not only the throne, but also a storm. Charles's reluctance to take strong stances on religion, his constant hedging between Catholic sympathy and Protestant necessity, had left. England divided and suspicious. James's open Catholicism only deepened the wound. Within 3 years, James II would be overthrown in the Glorious Revolution, a direct consequence of the instability Charles's reign had fostered. In that sense, Charles's gambling did not end with his death. The dice he rolled, the bargains he struck, the debts he left behind, all continued to tumble through history. His recklessness helped pave the way for the constitutional monarchy that followed, where kings would be checked not by cards, but by Parliament's firm hand. Yet still, people remembered him with affection. Perhaps that was his greatest gamble of all. That charm could outlast ruin, and this, he may have been right. Today, Charles II is remembered less for his debts and more for his charisma. less for the treaties he broke, more for the theaters he opened. Less for the kingdoms he risked, more for the laughter he gave. There is a certain poetry in it. Charles, who lived by luck, is remembered by love. Still, the lessons linger. His court became the blueprint of decadence, influencing not only his successors, but also continental courts that followed. The idea that a king could treat politics as a game would not vanish. It would echo in France, in Austria, in every palace where monarchs forgot that crowns are heavier than gold. And what of Charles himself in his final moments? Some say he repented, confessing sins and reconciling with the Catholic faith he had danced around his entire reign. Others insist he died as he lived, laughing, joking, even in the shadow of death. The truth is probably somewhere between. He was, after all, a man who lived in contradictions, frivolous yet shrewd, reckless yet calculating, irreverent yet deeply aware of the stakes. In the end, Charles II gambled not just with money, but with history. And history, unlike dice, does not forgive so easily. The candlelight of his court has long since gone out. The cards have been packed away, the dice silenced, the laughter faded into dust. But in the memory of England, the image endures. A tall, dark-haired king with a twinkle in his eye, scattering gold across a table as kingdoms trembled around him. The king who could not stop gambling. The story of Charles II did not end with his burial in Westminster Abbey. In truth, the wagers he placed, the debts he left, and the habits he cultivated cast long shadows across England, rippling far into the future. His gambling spirit, reckless, charming, dangerous, became both a cautionary tale and a strange kind of legend. To understand what followed, one must first understand the world Charles had shaped. His reign had restored the monarchy after years of Puritan rule, and in doing so, he had also restored color, music and laughter to a nation that had grown gray under Oliver Cromwell. Theaters reopened, women returned to the stage, taverns rang with song, and the arts flourished. Painters like Peter Lilly immortalized the beauty of his mistresses, while architects like Christopher Wren rebuilt London after the Great Fire of 1666. Yet behind this golden glow, there remained the gambler's hand, always shifting, always hedging. Every stroke of policy carried the same uncertainty as the turning of a card. Charles had wagered England's future on French subsidies, securing money from Louis XIV in exchange for promises that danced on the edge of betrayal. He had wagered his people's trust on his ability to balance Protestant Parliament with his Catholic sympathies. He had wagered his dynasty on illegitimate heirs, dozens of them, each granted titles and wealth, but none able to inherit the throne. It was as if he believed to the very end that luck would save him, but luck is fickle. When James II took the crown after Charles's death, he inherited not only a throne, but a trap. The divisions Charles had papered over, between Catholic and Protestant, between Parliament and monarchy, between English independence and French influence, all came roaring to the surface. James, less charming and far more rigid, could not laugh away opposition the way his brother had. Within 3 years, he was overthrown, placed by William of Orange and Mary in the glorious Revolution of 1688. The irony was not lost on historians. Charles, who had gambled so recklessly with his kingdom, had managed to keep his crown intact through wit and luck. James, cautious and serious, lost it almost immediately. Perhaps Charles had been right to trust charm over caution, or perhaps his gambling had simply delayed the inevitable, leaving James to pay the final bill. Still, Charles's reputation endured in curious ways. Poets and playwrights remembered him with warmth, the merry monarch who brought joy after a season of sorrow. Satirists mocked him, painting him as a king forever chasing women and dice. Some clergymen condemned him, warning that his sins had brought God's wrath upon the realm. Yet ordinary Londoners often spoke of him with affection, recalling the way he mingled with commoners. How he stopped to listen to petitions in the street, or how he could turn a moment of despair into laughter with a single quip. This was Charles's greatest gamble of all, the gamble of memory. And on that table, he seems to have one. For centuries afterward, English people would remember him more for his wit than his debts, more for his lovers than his political failings, more for his laughter than his betrayals. In a world where so many monarchs were remembered as tyrants or fools, Charles stood apart, remembered as a man who, though flawed, seemed profoundly alive. And yet the lessons of his reign were etched deeply into the monarchy. His successors, watching the chaos of his spending and his endless gambling, began to treat royal finances with greater caution. Parliament, once cowed by the power of kings, learned that a monarch who played too freely with trust could be bound tighter by law. Out of Charles's recklessness grew the foundations of a constitutional system that would eventually tame the crown itself. In that sense, his gambling was not just a personal vice. It was a historical turning point. The image of Charles at the gaming table became almost mythic. He was imagined tossing dice with the same casual air with which he signed treaties, wagering gold and kingdoms in the same breath. Some stories claimed he even gambled away his nights, deciding which mistress to visit by the draw of a card, whether truth or invention. The tales carried the same message. Charles was a man who trusted fortune more than planning, chance more than certainty. But what drove this compulsion? Perhaps it was the trauma of his youth. As a young prince, Charles had fled for his life during the English Civil War, wandering across Europe as an exile. He had seen his father, Charles I, executed by his own people, the king's head falling before the eyes of a horrified world. He had lived on the charity of foreign courts, sometimes penniless, sometimes disguised, always aware that his crown hung by a thread. For such a man, the world itself must have seemed like a gamble. Survival a matter of luck, fortune always one card away from ruin. When he regained the throne in 1660, perhaps it was inevitable that he treated it the same way he treated dice and cards. Life had taught him that nothing was certain, that fortunes could vanish overnight, that only chance determined survival. Gambling was not just a pastime. It was the pattern of his life, so he wagered. With money, with women, with politics, with history itself. The echoes of Charles's gambling spread far beyond England. Continental courts gossiped about his recklessness, and monarchs either mocked him or secretly admired his audacity. In France, Louis XIV saw in him a useful ally, but also a warning of what might happen if a king let charm replace discipline. In Spain, his frivolity confirmed their disdain for the once feared English throne. In the Netherlands, his unpredictability made him a constant source of both danger and opportunity. But no one could deny that he was unforgettable. Even today, Charles II stands out among kings. Not for his victories in battle, nor for his triumphs in diplomacy, but for the way he embodied a certain philosophy, that life itself is a game to be played boldly, recklessly, and with laughter. And though his reign left debts, divisions, and an unstable dynasty, it also left color, culture, and joy. He may not have been the most responsible king, but he was, without doubt, one of the most human. As night falls on his story, one can almost hear it still. Clatter of dice on polished wood, the rustle of cards in candlelight, the laughter of a king who knew that even crowns are just chips on the table of history. The king who could not stop gambling. The Great Fire of London in 1666 was not just a disaster of flame and ashid, was a test of chance. In the smoke and panic, as half the city was reduced to embers, people whispered that it was divine punishment for the king's sins, his mistresses, his gaming, his feasts. Yet even in that calamity, Charles played his role with a gambler's hand. He rushed to the fire himself, passing buckets of water, urging on citizens, working with soot on his face, and his royal sleeves rolled up. It was an extraordinary sight, England's king fighting the blaze alongside the lowest laborers. In that moment, strange as it may seem, restored some faith in him. The gambler had bet that showing himself among his people would earn their loyalty again, and for a while it did. But the fire was only one throw of the dice. Wars with the Dutch loomed, draining the treasury dry. Charles borrowed endlessly, pawning the very future of his reign to keep the fleets afloat. The coffers emptied, the loans multiplied, and still he laughed, still he played, still he entertained at Whitehall. Ministers and courtiers shook their heads, wondering how a man could gamble so recklessly with both his crown and his kingdom. Yet Charles, ever the optimist, always believed the next hand would bring fortune. And what of his pleasures? They never ceased. His palace was a revolving door of mistresses and favorites, each one granted titles, jewels, or homes in exchange for their charms. Some he truly loved, others he kept for convenience, but all of them became part of his legend. Among them, Nell Gwyn stood apart, the actress who had once sold oranges to theatergoers, who joked and bantered with the king as though he were a common man. She was his joy, his escape from politics, and perhaps the only woman who ever made him laugh at himself. When people complained of her low birth, Charles defended her with a shrug. I am but a man, and she is but a woman. It was the gambler's excuse, simple, disarming, impossible to argue with. Through these years, the court became a spectacle. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their kings in astonishment at the merry chaos of Whitehall. Music filled the halls, wine flowed like rivers, dice clattered across velvet tables, and the king moved through it all with easy grace, never seeming burdened by the weight of his debts or the dangers circling his throne. He had learned that power was theater, and he played his part as though the world itself were his audience. But danger was never far away. The plague had struck London the year before the fire, taking tens of thousands of lives. Fear stalked the streets, and suspicion turned toward the king. Some believed he had angered God. Others accused him of secret Catholic sympathies that threatened England's Protestant soul. He made promises he never intended to keep, juggled alliances, and shifted policies as though shuffling a deck of cards. One day he leaned toward France, the next toward Holland, never revealing his true hand until the moment demanded it. It was this ability to gamble with loyalty, with trust, with faith itself that kept him on the throne where another man might have fallen. He understood the game better than anyone, that survival lay not in rigid principles, but in flexibility, charm, and the art of risk. He could not control plague, nor fire, nor war. But he could control the impression he left in the minds of his people. So he laughed, he dazzled, he gambled, until even those who despised him could not look away. Every decision he made seemed like a coin tossed into the air, spinning between fortune and disaster. Sometimes he won, often he lost, yet always he played again. That was the nature of Charles II, the king who could not stop gambling. Not with cards, not with women, not with politics, not even with fate itself. In the final years of his reign, Charles seemed to grow even more comfortable in the role he had carved out for himself. He had weathered plague and fire, wars and bankruptcies, scandals and betrayals, yet somehow remained standing. To the world he appeared untouchable, an eternal gambler who always found a way to survive the game. But beneath the laughter, behind the twinkle in his eye, lay the truth that the debts never stopped accumulating. The crown owed money to bankers, to nobles, to merchants across Europe. Each loan was another gamble, another desperate wager that tomorrow would bring a victory or a windfall. Sometimes the king even borrowed directly from his mistresses, charming them into opening their private purses to fund his pleasures. They gave freely, not because they believed in his politics, but because he had the uncanny ability to make everyone believe they were the most important piece on his board. Each woman thought herself his queen, though none wore the crown, yet the kingdom itself bore the weight of his risks. Taxes pressed harder, discontent simmered, and whispers of disloyalty spread among the people. Still, Charles leaned on the same tools that had carried him since exile: wit, grace, and the ability to turn a scandal into a jest before anyone else could strike the blow. He made enemies laugh when they wanted to rage. He made allies forgive when they wanted to demand payment. He made his subjects cheer, even as their bellies ached from hunger. And through it all, the gaming tables remained his sanctuary. In the late hours, when politics fell silent and the court was drowsy with wine, the king would sit with cards in his hands, a candle flickering against his dark eyes. The air would fill with the soft shuffle of the deck, the clink of coins, the laughter of companions who dared risk a fortune against their sovereign. Sometimes he lost deliberately, gifting a victory to a favored courtier. Other times he won everything, sweeping the table clean as though fate itself had bent to his will. For Charles, the game was not about money, it was about the thrill. The illusion that chance could be mastered if only he smiled at it long enough. By now, his body had grown weary, though he hid it well. Years of indulgence left their marks. The heaviness in his step, the lingering cough, the pallor that crept into his cheeks. Yet he never showed fear, never allowed the court to see weakness. To the end, he remained the charming king, the laughing gambler, the man who seemed always one move ahead of ruin. But fortune, fickle as ever, could not be charmed forever. In February of 1685, Charles rose from bed as usual, planning another day of meetings, wagers, and pleasures. Within hours, he collapsed with a sudden seizure. The court was thrown into chaos as doctors rushed forward, bleeding him, dosing him with strange concoctions, desperate to revive the monarch. He lingered for days, slipping in and out of consciousness, while the court outside whispered and schemed over who would inherit his throne. Even in those final hours, Charles could not resist one last jest. Knowing the end was near, he turned to those gathered at his bedside and murmured, "I am sorry, gentlemen, for being such a long time dying." It was the gambler's farewell half apology, half performance, as though even death were just another hand to be played with style. When he finally passed, the laughter faded, and England mourned the loss of a king who had ruled through fire, plague, scandal, and wore not with discipline or austerity, but with the daring, reckless spirit of a man who gambled everything and somehow made the game his crown. Charles II was remembered not as a saint nor a tyrant, but as a survivor, a player, a man who lived his life as though every moment were a throw of the dice. And as the candles burned low in Whitehall Palace, one could almost imagine the sound of cards being shuffled, coins clinking, and laughter. Echoing faintly in the dark, the ghost of a king who never stopped gambling, not even with time itself. When the doors of Whitehall finally closed upon the reign of Charles II, there lingered more than the scent of extinguished candles and the hush of mourning courtiers. What remained was a memory of a monarch who lived not by the rules of kingship, but by the thrill of chance. History does not always remember him with reverence. Some call him frivolous, a libertine who squandered the wealth of England on women, wine, and cards. They whisper that he cared more for dice than decrees, more for silken beds than battlefields, yet others curiously recall him with fondness, even admiration. For in his reckless laughter, there was something deeply human, something that mirrored the restless desires of his people. He was flawed undeniably, but he was alive in a way that few sovereigns allowed themselves to be. The England he left behind bore the fingerprints of his wagers. The royal coffers, perpetually strained, carried the echoes of loans and losses. The navy, though neglected in funding, still sailed with the swagger he had demanded when he played rival against the Dutch and the French. London, rebuilt after the fire, stood as both his inheritance and his gift to posterity, a city scarred, yet thriving, much like the king himself. But more than buildings, ships, or laws, it was the atmosphere of his court that endured. It was called the Merry Court for good reason. Here in glittering chambers, gamblers, poets, actors, and mistresses mingled as if hierarchy itself had been tossed aside like a die. The line between crown and commoner blurred, not through democracy, but through indulgence. A talented wit could rise to favor as quickly as a nobleman. A courtesan could whisper more influence into the king's ear than any statesman. It was a world ruled by charm, risk, and desire, gambling table of human ambition. Even in the arts, Charles's appetite for pleasure left its mark. He brought the theater back to life after Puritan suppression, and with it, he allowed women for the first time to take the stage. What had once been a forbidden art became a vibrant spectacle, filled with voices and faces that reshaped English culture. One might say that this, too, was a gamble he rolled the dice on decadence, and the world became brighter, more alive because of it. And then there were the women, the many women who circled his life like stars around a reckless sun. Barbara Villiers, bold and tempestuous, who could command his attention with a single glance. Nell Gwyn, the orange seller turned actress, whose laughter charmed not only the king but an entire nation weary of solemn rulers. Louise Day, the French mistress whose presence in his bed doubled as an embassy. Each woman was a story, each affair another hand in the endless game of love and politics. Charles did not hide these liaisons, he flaunted them. Where other monarchs cloaked their desires in secrecy, he made scandal part of his performance. And strangely, the people forgave him for it, as if they preferred a king who sinned openly to one who pretended at virtue. Yet forgiveness does not erase consequence. His heirs were illegitimate, his dynasty fragile. His brother James would inherit the throne, but not the charm. Where Charles was playful, James was stern. Where Charles courted laughter, James courted division. The merry reign gave way to stormy years, and one wonders if England did not look back wistfully, longing for the gambler who, for all his flaws, made life feel like a grand and unpredictable game. To think of Charles II is to imagine a candlelit room filled with smoke, with murmurs, with the rustle of silks and the shuffle of cards. The king leans back in his chair, a glass of wine in one hand, the other poised over the table, about to play his next move. He is not worried, not fearful, for to him the outcome hardly matters. Win or lose, it is the act of playing that gives life its meaning. That was the philosophy of his reign. Better to risk, better to laugh, better to gamble everything than to sit idle and safe. And perhaps that is why he endures in memory. He was not the greatest of kings, nor the most disciplined, nor the most successful in politics or war. But he was a king who understood the rhythm of desire, who knew how to make a weary nation forget its sorrows, if only for a night. He was, in the end, the gambler king, and history has no other quite like him. So, when we whisper his story at bedtime, we do not tell it as a warning alone. We tell it as a lullaby of chance, a reminder that even sovereigns are caught in the roll of dice. That power itself is fragile, fleeting, and subject to fortune's fickle hand. In the hush of night, with eyes heavy and thoughts drifting, one can almost hear him again, the soft laugh of Charles II. The faint clink of a wager laid down, the eternal shuffle of cards in a game that never truly ends.